The Dangers of Religious Freedom. That had been the title of Linda Woodhead's lecture ever since we invited her a couple of months ago. But the topic has become ever more relevant, ever so urgent in the light of the recent Paris attacks. It was then when we invited her that she already said that Europe is sleepwalking into a situation in which religion becomes like a regulation-free zone. And that, she said, is something we should not wish for our society. Well, maybe the facts have proven her right. Maybe we have woken up now. Anyway, she is here now. She's sitting in the first row. We're very happy to have her here. She will lecture on this topic tonight. Linda Woodhead. She is a sociologist of religion at Lancaster University in the UK. She is one of the world's leading experts on religion, and she has published extensively on religious change since the 1980s and also on the relationship between religion and society. For example, in God and Human Dignity, a sociology of religious emotion, and in more recent book chapter, Legal Religion and Illegal Secularism. After her lecture, she will speak to Sophie van Bijsterveld, who is a professor in religion, law, and society here at Radboud University, and also a member of the Dutch Senate. And philosopher Kees Lijnhorst will chair this discussion. My name is Liesbeth Jansen. I'm a member of staff at the Radboud Reflects. I wish you all a very intriguing evening. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you all very much for coming tonight, and I hope that there'll be something of interest to you, and I hope you'll join in the conversation at the end. So obviously, given this topic, which, as Lisbeth says, and thank you very much to Lisbeth and your team for really excellent organisation and for inviting me. Given that we had decided on this topic, I'd proposed this topic in any case. Of course, it would be silly not to talk about what happened in Paris, but as explained, that wasn't why I wrote this lecture. Paris just reinforces the points I wanted to make anyway, and it's a very vivid illustration of some of the things I want to argue, and why I think we need to change or strongly develop our public approach to religion in Europe. I want to suggest that we've actually, in some ways, contributed to the difficult situation that we find ourselves in Europe at the moment. And I also want to make two controversial claims. I want to suggest that the drive, the campaigns, the lobbying for religious freedom that are going on at the moment from the West, even though many of their supporters are very well intentioned, are in some ways not well thought through. And I also want to suggest something controversial about religion, which is that it has a tendency towards extremism. That is its natural tendency, not towards peace, but towards extremism. Let me just start by reminding you of Article 9 of the UN and European Conventions on Human Rights. That's the European, which is what the campaigns for religious freedom base themselves on. So I want to start by clarifying what the problem is that we're facing today. Got to get a problem clear before you can see what the solution is. Well, the immediate problem is, how do you react to something like Paris? How do you deal with the kind of religious extremism which was so horribly visible on Friday in Paris? But that's just a presenting small problem. There's a much bigger problem, a much broader problem. The problem is we've got ourselves in a state of double think, of having two bits of our mind that are competing with each other. We think contradictory things at the same time. On the one hand, we think that religious freedom is absolutely vital, as enshrined here, and that it is the first freedom. Religious freedom is the first freedom. here's a little illustration. I could have picked hundreds and hundreds. I just pulled this off the web. It's called First American Freedom. Your Faith is Being Rewritten, and it's a big campaign to guarantee religious freedom as first freedom. Religious freedom, it's being argued, is the most important freedom. It's the foundational freedom from which everything else derives. This argument is most strongly made in the United States of America. This comes from the United States of America. This is the Catholic bishops of America, the Roman Catholic bishops of America, sponsoring this campaign. America has, for very understandable historical reasons, a deep attachment to religious freedom. It thinks it's the first freedom, because if you think about the way America was constituted, it was constituted, partly in its imagination, partly in reality, by people who were fleeing from religious intolerance in Europe, and for whom religion was the space in which they were free. They went to America, they were migrants to a new land, in order to be able to express their faith freely. So for many Americans, it's religion which is the zone of freedom, and it's the state which is the zone of unfreedom. So they want to keep a wall of separation between religion, that's where we're really free, and the state, which is always trying to oppress and interfere with religion. So as you know, the American Constitution has a wall that separates the state from interfering with religion. So this American agenda has been growing and growing since the end of the Cold War. It's a way in which America wants to do cultural diplomacy. It's a way in which America wants to spread, not by force and violence, but through culture, through its ideas. It wants to spread this ideology around the world, that every country must respect religious freedom. And it has very powerful and central government-funded bodies now which monitor religious freedom. They issue a report on every country in the world with a scale of how free or unfree it is in the way it treats religion. And they're aiming towards a state, like America, of separation of the state and complete religious freedom, a kind of religious free market where you're free to choose religion. Now, this agenda has been wholly adopted by the European Union, which now has people supporting and campaigning for these same things. And in most European countries, including my own, there are very good people who are quite rightly very disturbed by religious persecution. In particular, many of them are motivated by the persecution of Christians by Muslims in the Middle East at the moment. And quite rightly, they want to campaign very hard against religious persecution. So part of us has accepted this agenda. And what's interesting is that both left-wing and right-wing politically, both have good reasons for thinking that they support this. That's part of its strength. Okay, so that's one thing we think. But at the same time, we're doing this kind of thing. So this came out last month in the UK. This is our national counter-extremism strategy. The government issues one of these every 5 years or so. This is the latest one. It's constantly changing the way it wants to deal with extremism. It mainly means Islamist extremism. It does talk about other forms of extremism. It's really worried about, but its main focus, obviously, is on the kind of forms of violence we saw in London in 2005, other places, including Paris recently. UK policy has shifted from being much more by extremism, violent extremism. It used to call its policy PVE, preventing violent extremism. So it was really worried about not extremism in general, but extremism when it becomes violent. Now it's just worried about extremism in toto. In other words, it's interested in ideas and speech as well as actions. It's not just trying to monitor and stop people who may perform violent actions. It's starting to monitor and police what people say and what people think, including on the internet. And this document, which you can download easily enough on the web, spells out the strategy. So here is our doublethink. On the one hand, we're saying religion should be completely free of state interference. It's a very loaded word. The state has no rights in the sphere of religion. On the other hand, we're saying we need to monitor and control religion and religious ideas. Now, you can't think, well, we are thinking both things at the same time, but it doesn't add up. There's something going wrong there. There's a muddle. There are some ways in which people try and pretend it isn't a muddle. One of the worst ways is when you see something like what happened in Paris or in the London bombings, to say that isn't religion. It's a very popular strategy, and political leaders use it, and religious leaders use it as well. And what they assume and what they say is that religions are naturally peaceful. At the core of all religions, all religions are united by a message of maybe do as you would be done by, love your neighbour, care for human beings, look after God's creation. And anything which doesn't agree with that is false. It's not religion. It's a distortion of religion. It's not the true religion. Well, I want to argue very strongly against that mistake. That assumption that religion is intrinsically peaceful. I want to suggest religion has a dynamic that leads towards extremism. Most of history, we moderate it and pull it back. Religious people do themselves. So I'm not saying religion is always extremist. I'm saying there's a tendency, and unless it's pulled back, that's how it goes. And we've become foolish and stopped moderating. And religious freedom is not helping with that. Okay, that's one not good way of saying there isn't really a muddle. Another bad way of saying our thinking isn't muddled at the moment is to say that, okay, religious freedom shouldn't be unlimited. People have a right to hold a religion, but not always to express their religion. They can do it in private. That's an absolute right to be religious in private, but not necessary to express it. Well, that doesn't really make sense, because what would a religion be that wasn't expressed? Try and imagine it. It's like Wittgenstein saying, imagine a private language. Imagine a private religion. What would you do? You might stay in your bedroom and pray all day, but you'd not ever talk to anyone about it, or write a book about it, or go on social media and talk to people who are also praying, or tell someone you're praying for them. It doesn't really make sense. It's certainly not religious freedom to say that religion must always be private. So you can't get round the problem of religious freedom in that way. There's also a difficulty if you say that there's a right to religious expression, but not to the point where it harms someone. That makes much more sense, I think. But it's often very, very difficult to draw the line between when a religious expression is harming and when it's not. Let me give you some examples. We, in the UK, and we're tighter on it than in the United States, and I'm not sure what your law is here, but incitement to religious hatred is outlawed. But this statement, I made it up, but is that an incitement to religious hatred? I don't think that would count as an incitement to religious hatred. It's merely an interpretation of France from a particular Islamist point of view. It's not telling anyone to go and kill anybody. So should freedom of expression protect people from saying that, posting that, giving a lecture that has those views? Should people be free or not to say that? What about that? You come across a group chanting that, is that fine? Well, a lot of you know that that's Psalm 137. So Jews and Christians chant that regularly in their services, and we don't worry at all about that. What about that one? Anyone know where that one's from? That's the catechism, the official catechism of the Roman Catholic Church. We don't worry at all about that one. Or, this one is actually worse, because it says not only that homosexuality is unnatural, against the order of creation, but that it's against revelation, it's against God's revelation, and you shouldn't even be pastorally compassionate, sensitive, accepting of it. So it's even a more hard line than the Catholic Church. That is the official teaching of my church, the Church of England, one of the mildest churches, so-called, mildest forms, meant to be one of the mildest forms of religion in the world. This is the official teaching, which is still being, the bishops say everybody must obey this teaching still. It's in a document called Issues in Human Sexuality. I'm going to come back to the Church of England because it's a good example of how a moderate religion has become quite extremist with statements like this. And of course, we all know other examples, which it's difficult to say, is that causing harm? Should it be prevented or not? What if a Christian wants to burn a Quran in public because it's full of false teaching? That happened in America. What if a Muslim wants to burn a crucifix in public as a protest? What if a French person wants to draw insulting cartoons of the Prophet? It's not obvious who's harmed. So there's a struggle between religious freedom lobby, which tends to err on the side of tolerate all these things, they're not actually harming, they're not actually violent, and politicians and security services, which are looking at the internet at this moment very, very carefully, and are not thinking about religious freedom very strongly. I want to suggest this muddle is at the heart of our problem. This is the problem we're dealing with. Okay, here's my other controversial bit. I want to suggest, against nearly everything I've been taught, that there is a conveyor belt to extremism, that religion has a conveyor belt to extremism. Possibly that's true for individuals, but I want to look at groups. I'm more of a sociologist, so I'm interested in how groups, I think there's a tendency for religious groups to march kind of inevitably towards a more extreme position unless there are countervailing, moderating forces. Well, this idea goes against everything that all theorists of modernization, all my fellow sociologists, all the people who believed in secularization have thought. Just to give you one very nice and good example, James Davison Hunter, an American sociologist, well, cultural commentator, wrote this book in 1987, Evangelicals, the Coming Generation. He said it was inevitable that evangelical Christianity would get more liberal because all religion liberalizes over time. It falls away from being strict, it gets less and less strict, and what's more, when it's in the context of a liberal country, and he was talking about American evangelicals, it can't resist the more persuasive liberal ideas that surround it. Well, most people thought like Hunter, and still do. Religion, it's hard to maintain strict religion. It's always declining. People always give it up and always get weaker and weaker in their religion, and they end up secular. That's the way things go. I think that's false. There's one thing I've ever read that takes a similar view to the one I'm going to suggest now. It's an article, it's a very obscure article written by a very obscure person called Charles Liebman, who was a professor in an Israeli university. And he was a political scientist and a commentator on Israel and Jewish life. And he was observing what was happening in Israel. So obviously he was watching the growth of ultra-Orthodoxy, which is still continuing. In Judaism as a whole, worldwide, ultra-Orthodoxy and ultra-Orthodoxy are growing. Reform and the liberal movements are shrinking. So he suggested religion has a dynamic of extremism. And I'm going to develop his ideas, and I've pushed them in a slightly different direction. Why does it? What's the case for this? First of all, just a quick word about terms. What is extremism? Well, the obvious, simple meaning of extremism is more and more is better. That's what, you want to go to the extreme. Bring it on, take it to the limit. That's extremism in its simplest sense. Now, religious extremism, I'll spell out in a moment, but it's very close. I'm meaning something really, you could use either words, the same as fundamentalism. Strangely, there are just these two different bodies of literature. One uses the word fundamentalism and one uses the word extremism, and they don't usually meet. But actually, there's a lot in common. I'm going to suggest that extremism is a process, and fundamentalism is just the name for the form that religious extremism takes in the modern world, because fundamentalism is a essentially modern movement. If we define fundamentalism to start with, there is endless. You could spend a happy 2 years reading all the books that try and define fundamentalism. But broadly, there's a sort of agreement. It's got these kind of characteristics. Fundamentalists believe there is only one body of truth, that it derives from God or a higher being, that they, the fundamentalists, have a uniquely privileged access to that truth. They've got the truth scrolls, they've got the way of getting to it. That you can state the truth in clear fundamental propositions. That's why it's called fundamentalism. You can lay it down in a set of fundamentals in textual written form. And that anyone who disagrees with those fundamentals is in error, is an enemy of the truth, an enemy of God. So it has a clear us and them mentality. Okay, there's a broad definition of fundamentalism, a modern movement. So some people would add it's opposed to secular modern. Now, extremism, I think, is a process. So fundamentalism is, as I said, a version of extremism. But extremism is better thought of as a process rather than a phenomenon or a thing. What's the process? Okay, so here's the process of dynamic of extremism. Number one, clarification. Extremism tries to clarify the truth into ever clearer, more definite statements, beliefs, propositions. So clarifying to certainty. It's seeking certainty. Here's the law. Here's what the law says about what you can do on the Sabbath, what you can't do. We'll get it clearer and clearer and clearer, more and more defined, more certain. Can you switch on a light? Yes or no? Can you switch the light on and off? Does that work? Well, there'll be a ruling on it. It'll get clearer what you can and can't do. Secondly, it's a process towards increasing strictness. So it's intensifying. So go back to my light switch example. Let's say at some stage in our religion, working on the Sabbath didn't include turning a light on. This is after electricity. Okay, it was okay, then it wasn't work, it was just turning the light on. But then a new group arises, or I arise and I say, no, you're just very weak, you're not really respecting God's truth. That is work. were not going to switch the light on the Sabbath day. You are stricter than they were. And there's a tendency to always move to stricter and stricter and stricter. Fundamentalism adds propositions, it doesn't subtract them. It adds commandments. That's a second dynamic. Thirdly, there's an expansionist drive to bring in more of life, the whole of life, not just private life, not just school life, not just family life, public life, the law. Bring in the whole of society into God's truth. And very often bring in as many people as possible. Convert the whole world to it, ideally. Fourthly, fourth dynamic, purification. Separating extremists from non-extremists. Separating the believers from the infidel, the truth from the falsehood, the true believers from the sinners. And fifthly, there's a tendency towards enforcing the truth with greater and greater amounts of force. Now, I don't want to argue, and I'm not going to, and I'll come back to this point, I don't want to argue that the extremist dynamic inevitably leads to violence. I don't believe that at all. I think most forms of religious extremism have nothing to do with violence and don't want violence and renounce violence. There is a connection between the two, and I'll come back to that. But I'm not suggesting that the process is all extremism leads to violence. But there's a very close connection between violence and extremism. So that's the dynamic of extremism, and I think it's inherent to religion. Why? Why is it? Why does it go in that direction? Well, you can probably see for yourself why there's a tendency to go in that direction, not the opposite direction. You can always purify a bit more. And like my light switch example, if you purify a bit more, you can say, we're the true believers, not that lot. I can set myself up in power. So there's a power motive to be the person who is stricter, the one who says, no, we must break from these ones, this group of Christians or Muslims or Jews, or they're not strict enough. We are the ones preserving the truth. So you can always make a power grab by getting stricter. Sometimes you break away. Also, you can't go backwards. There's no reverse gear on this conveyor belt, because that would be to admit that you'd made a mistake. And because you're certain you have the truth, that's one thing you can't do. So you can't go back. There's no pulling back. Third reason, there's no opposition. Not only do you try and expel opposition from those in your group and around you, but where there is opposition, you turn it into confirmation. So people who try and say you're false, you say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Because they hate us. And there's a conspiracy, and they know we have the truth. So you can never accept opposition. You can never accept the feedback that's saying there are other views, what you're doing is wrong. Opposition gets confirmatory. France hates Muslims. So Hollande says, we're at war on ISIL. See, they hate Muslims. It's a confirmatory process. The more you oppose extremism, the more you confirm their view. And final reason is that strict religious people are obedient and very easy to organise. Liberal, moderate religious people never do what they're told. If you want to set up an entryist group, Church of England's a good example, you get your group and you say, look, we're going to stand for these elections, we're going to get into this, we're going to take over this decision-making thing, and people do what they're told. The Liberals can never organise. They never do what they're told, and they find it very hard to oppose well-organised religious extremism. Also, they say, well, it's freedom of religion. They're free to express these views, and we must just argue against them, but we mustn't block them. Good news for extremism. So let me give you an example. I've just written a book about this example. It's the Church of England. It's not out till February, but it's in my mind because I've just finished writing this book. This is about the decline of the Church of England, but it's a tale of how religion became more extreme. And I've picked it because it's so counterintuitive. I don't want to pick Islam, it's too obvious. I'm picking the most liberal, mild, seemingly gentle, actually it wasn't historically, form of religion, to show how even that has gone down the extremist dynamic. Obviously, it hasn't gone all the way down the dynamic, but that's the direction it's going in. Let me just take the example of homosexuality. I'll take you back to the Church of England's statement on homosexuality. Now, the Church of England was always full of gay people. Okay? A very large proportion of Anglican priests have always been gay in history, more than in the general population. If you were gay, being made a priest in the Church of England was a natural career choice. So how did that church get to this position? It got to this position because liberals thought people didn't have a clear doctrine about the church and homosexuality. It was just how it was. Everyone knew that people were gay, and that's how it was. And English culture, until the 80s, 90s, like church culture, and they're very close, they used to be very close, had a policy of don't ask, don't tell. So people who were gay, people kind of knew, but no one talked about it in society and in the church. And then everything was fine. Then you get explicit campaigning for gay rights, and suddenly it's not fine. You've got to make a clear statement. Are you against equality on the grounds of sexuality, or are you for it? And there the church gets into a horrific muddle. What happened was a very small group of conservative evangelicals mobilized to put a resolution to the church synod, group like this, it's all in a little parliament. They had planned this. They'd put this motion saying that the Bible says that sex should only take place within marriage, between a man and a woman, and it's permanent, and never outside it. And the Liberals just completely lost their nerve, and this motion got passed and went into the law of the church. Now, once it was there, they mobilised more and more. And by this time, they're linking up with conservative Anglicans in the USA and in Sydney Diocese in Australia and in Nigeria. And they're getting a lot of money, particularly from Australia and America, and they're organising. So when the Archbishop calls his 8-year meeting of all the archbishops, they've got, this is early in the days when you had computers, a whole bank of computers. They've got their strategy worked out. They're there with people going into every talk, every meeting, every resolution. They're pushing that agenda. The Liberals are just outclassed. They don't know what to do, and they think, no one really believes this. It's not really. No one's ever going to take it seriously. We've got to give them freedom anyway. We can't be oppressive. We can't stop people saying these things, and so on and so on. So the more the church became, took a very extreme line on the Bible's view on women and the Bible's view on gay people, the more then ordinary people in England think, I don't want anything to do with this church. So the bulk of people stop going to church. Every young generation is half as likely as their parents to go to church because it contradicts their values and it seems dogmatic. So then the extreme camp have more of it and get more control, and then they elect leaders and bishops who agree with them. And now there's, all the Church of England, which has 100 and something bishops, there is one who will oppose this teaching. And it happened over 30 years. And that's the story that we tell in the book. So it wasn't really Islam that convinced me about the conveyor belt, it was the Church of England, which sounds rather funny. So, my next section is on the opposite tendencies. What moderates religion? Because in most of history, religion is pretty moderate and not extreme. So obviously there are these other forces that act against the extremism dynamic. What are they? I think they're different in different countries. It depends very much on the history of a country. But here are some of the things that act normally to moderate extremism and slow down the conveyor belt or stop it. Let me divide them into categories. First of all, I want to talk about cultural and educational things. And I'm moving on a bit now to thinking about our situation now in Europe, and also things that we can do, things that can help stop a drift to extremism. You can take it for granted I don't like the drift to extremism. So first of all, cultural and educational things that moderate. I mean, part of the reason why extremism has been growing since, let's say, 1979, which was when the Iranian Revolution took place, is that the alternative values have ceased to be as compelling. Secular values, the modern project, modern political projects, they're not making a very strong counter case. They're not making a strong enough counter case to appeal to extremists. Extremists, even members of ISIL, aren't nihilists. They're not people who don't care about anything. They're the opposite. They're idealists. They want to change the world. They have a vision of a perfect world, living in perfect obedience, where everyone will know how they should be and there will be perfect harmony. They're pure idealists. And they don't find the alternatives that are on offer very convincing. They're not convinced the West's liberal democracy is a better way of living. They're certainly not convinced that the secular projects of Middle Eastern post-war states were better ways of living. So one of the moderating influences is simply that there are better alternatives to extremism. There have to be. People have to be able to make a clear case for their values, their ideology. Liberals tend to just think, yeah, of course our way of life's better. But why? Can you defend it? I get my first years to be half liberals and half fundamentalists, and they have to convince each other why one is better than the other. Well, none of them are fundamentalists in reality, but the fundamentalists always win. Because the liberals can't say why they think a liberal democratic way of life is better. Well, then you might say, well, liberals shouldn't have to because it's not a dogmatic ideology with clear statements that you beat someone over the head with. But you've got to, your ideology has to convince. Are we good at explaining what our values are and why they should appeal? That's a cultural thing. Another cultural factor, so compelling, when secularism was a compelling project, it moderated. That was Lieberman's point. Judaism was moderate and liberal when the secular Zionist project was the most appealing one. Okay. Other cultural factors that moderate. Really good intellectual engagement and educational engagement between religious people and the best of all thought. You know, the Christian tradition, for example, founded universities. This was a Catholic university. The churches used to be at the heart of the best education there was. That's a moderating force because it keeps religion open to truth and the development of our understanding. Where you've got a good articulation between the intellectual life of a country or culture and religion, that's a powerful moderating force. I think in this country you now have chairs of Islamic theology, don't you? And you have some steps that recognise this. So rather than saying religion should be a private matter, like in America. You can't teach it in the schools, you can't teach it theology in universities, you have to do that as a private matter. In Europe, actually, this should be an advantage that we have a history of having theology and religious people educated inside the state system, the educational system. I think good religious education in schools is a very, very important force of moderation. And in some ways, the most important cultural forces of moderation are definitely not science or technology or management. Most fundamentalists, this is very well known, a lot of the recent Islamic ones who are homegrown are trained in technical subjects. Many scientists are fundamentalists, and all are fundamentalist. The big immunizers, in a way, seem to be history and social science, because they make you step back from your own position and see it as contingent. See that it has been different in the past, and it will be different again in the future. So history has always been extremely difficult for fundamentalism. Its origins lie in rejecting the historical criticism of the Bible. And social science is still very unacceptable to many religions, including some of the churches. The Church of England hates social science. It hates people telling them about itself. Not going to like my book. I am a member of the Church of England. I have to keep saying that. So cultural and educational factors, very important moderating forces. Second category are social and political forces of moderation. And here I am in favour of state involvement. Interference is too loaded a word. Good state engagement with religion, not a wall of separation like religious freedom calls for. Again, in Europe, we have a history of the state taking an interest in religion. It set up its state churches. This can and should have been a good thing. This is why the Church of England used to be very moderate, because the bishops were part of Parliament, and Parliament controlled the church. In Denmark's the only country where this is still really true. Denmark's the only country that still has a ministry of religion in Europe. So when the Danish Parliament passed legislation allowing same-sex marriage, the church had to do it, because it's a state church. It was the same, it used to be the same in the UK, and we still have an established church, but Parliament said, we can't be bothered with it. Let them run themselves. And that was the point when the extremists took over in the Church of England, when Parliament stopped taking an interest and having a say in how the national church ran itself. So those old ways may not be appropriate, but states need to understand and have an open and intelligent engagement with religion, and not say, let's leave it all up to the faiths, keep out, let faith leaders sort it out for themselves. There's a kind of invisible hand that'll make it all come right. That's not going to happen. So good and intelligent ways in which states, in their historic context, can deal with religion. Also, preserve, maintain, cherish the insertion points of religion into wider society, like chaplaincies in schools, in hospitals, in the armed forces, like I've talked about university departments, connections between religion and those. They're incredibly important. They're where religious people meet ordinary people and vice versa. They keep it real. They keep people arguing, talking, engaging with each other. They stop religion going out, becoming separatist. And the state often funds them. And that has moderated religion in Europe for a very long time. The fact that the state funds faith schools, lots of ordinary people go to them. It's in hospitals, it's in universities, chaplaincies, and so on. Those are good things for moderation. And then finally, the moderating forces have to do with the way in which religions themselves are organised. How are the decisions made? A really crucial thing here is how far are religious leaders accountable? We've got a very bad situation at the moment where religious leaders, you don't know how they're appointed, and you don't know how to get rid of them, and you don't know who they represent. But political leaders just assume they're like a democratically elected political leader. So they think, oh, if this spokesperson for the Jewish community says all Jews are against same-sex marriage, that must be true. So in the UK, when the Archbishop of Canterbury stood up in the House of Lords and said, the majority of Anglicans and the majority of religious people in this country are opposed to same-sex marriage, the government believed him. And it was false, because I do surveys. It wasn't true. The majority of people were not opposed in the churches. But the government just listens. It doesn't do any research. It doesn't ask academics. It doesn't see that religious leaders aren't necessarily representative of the views of religious people. Let me give you another example, which I heard in interviewing people the other day. So the big controversy at the moment in Britain is over euthanasia. And the faith leaders all issued it goes through Parliament regularly, and it was rejected. But before it was rejected, the faith leaders issued a statement saying, we are all opposed to this. You know, we all stand together, every religion, we are opposed to allowing euthanasia. And I interviewed the chief reform rabbi. Okay, that's one of the liberal bits of Judaism. It has its own rabbi. I interviewed her, she's a woman, I said, what was the process whereby you all announced that you were all against euthanasia? And she said, well, we all met in a room, and then we were invited to say what we thought, and every leader, she said that there were 2 women, but all the men, they all went round and they said, yes, my community is opposed to it. Yes, my community is opposed to it. Yes, my community. And when it came to Laura, she said, I don't know. I haven't asked them. I haven't done the research. We haven't had a conversation. We haven't had a poll about it. So I can't say my community is opposed. So why were the people who hadn't done that work convinced their community was opposed? What they were saying was, I think the teachings of my religion are against it. Fair enough. But you see, politicians don't read it like that. They think, oh, they're all opposed, so we mustn't, on the grounds of religious freedom, we have to do. So it's very important, moderating influence, to get more and more ordinary religious people's voices heard. Because most religious people, I know this from polling in the UK, are moderate. But their voices don't get heard because the leaders say they're not real Muslims, they're not real Christians, they're not real, etc. And worse than that, religion is constantly changing and growing and new forms develop. And as people in Europe are getting disillusioned with the old faiths, many of them now say, we're spiritual, not religious. And some are pagans, and some are New Age, and some are eco-this, and so on. Those people never come to the table. The interfaith groups don't let them in. They don't meet the politicians. They don't get the same respect. They don't get the same representation. So you're always getting a false representation of the religious landscape. Politicians don't have enough intelligence, I mean, in the broad sense, to, good information. I don't mean they're stupid, because they're not, but they don't have the good information about who says what in religion. We're moving very rapidly to a position in Britain where no religion is the majority position, but most of those people aren't secular. But their category isn't on the census. If you if you do surveys and you put Jewish, Christian, Muslim, whatever, and you put no religion, a lot of people say that, but if you put other, a lot of people put that. We don't have that on our census. A lot of people are other these days, and that's interesting. So, how decisions are made in religions themselves, how you get good research about religions into decision-making, because that gives ordinary people voice, and what the status of leaders is, and how they're accountable. Because once a religious leader sets themselves up, how can you get rid of them? They might be dangerous, they might be unrepresentative. What mechanism does that religion have of transparency and accountability? These are questions that should be being asked because they're moderating issues. So I'm going to wrap up. Let me bring the remarks back to the situation and Paris and some of the things they might say about how we should react. I just wanted to make the point again that I'm not arguing that religions lead inevitably to violence. I don't think that's true at all. So you can have a lot of extremist forms of religion which do no one harm and are very peaceful. Most are peaceful. Most of the people who are the young, mostly men, who are carrying out the attacks at the moment, both homegrown and coming from the Middle East, are not particularly well educated theologically. A lot of the ones from Europe know very little about the Quran and Islamic interpretation and teaching. They're not deeply religious scholars. A lot of them are people who are in some kind of already inducted into violence. There's a huge amount of pornographic use. There's a lot of violence towards women, at least in attitudes, if not reality. There's a lot of gang culture, background, and linkages. Violent pornography. A lot of the porn stashes of violent pornography. It's not made enough of. It's very important because people aren't naturally violent. You have to be socialized into violence. So here are people who are attracted to violence anyway, and then you get the perfect ideology which explains why it's needed and why it's part of a broader purpose. And instead of feeling hopeless, it gives you a sense of power and strength and idealism. So your violent inclinations get the right ideology. That's the link, I think, between violence and extremism. So most religious people, extremists, not violent, but some people who are predisposed to violence get linked in, and then you get a really explosive, literally horrible mixture. And we keep seeing that happening. So in that sense, extreme views are dangerous because they can be used in that way. So how do we react to something like Paris? Well, you don't react in an extreme way. You don't use fire to fight fire because, as I've explained, the fundamentalist wants opposition. They're trying to provoke people to say, we hate Muslims, we're going to bomb them, we're going to abuse their human rights. They want to say, see, Europe says it stands for toleration and democracy and liberalism, but look what they're doing. Look at how they torture us. Look at extra rendition. They don't really believe their values. They're skin deep. So the point with fundamentalism is never react directly. Set your own agenda. The big question here is who sets the agenda? And at the moment, ISIL will be quite happy that it keeps setting the agenda. And Western politicians are running around in circles, reacting. We need, as a culture and a society, if we believe in our values, and we believe they're the right values, we need to be able to defend them and live by them and set our own agenda. And you act from strength, not fear, from knowing what you stand for and standing by that. So ISIL doesn't like the fact that you're taking in Syrian refugees. That doesn't suggest what their propaganda is, that the West hates Muslims. Look what it did in Bosnia. It hates them. It wants to kill them. You're taking in refugees. You're treating them well. It hates that. If the reaction is now, no more Syrians because there are some terrorists in them, they'll say, well, it proves they didn't, that's what we said all along. So you have to keep your own agenda. Keep on doing what you believe to be right. Of course, I'm not a woolly liberal. You'd have to deal very effectively, including using violence, against the violent. But you could do it, and actually I think most of what our security services do is doing this, with seriously good intelligence, quietly, effectively, behind the scenes, and not to show how macho you are, and not to make a political statement. I'm sure you'll say quite rightly, I've not talked about the media's role in any of this, and that's a big omission, and I've just kept it out because it's a whole other subject which we might want to touch on in our conversation, but I don't have time tonight. But how the media behaves is very, very important as well, and quite hard to regulate and control. So my message is that there's a bigger picture here and a longer story. It's not just how do we deal with ISIL now, or even how do we deal with Syria, which is actually a much bigger and more important question, I think. There's a much bigger question, which is how do we keep the forces of moderation, keeping religion moderate, and stop the extremist conveyor belt rolling on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think before we start the discussion, I ask Sophie van Bijswart, can you give short reaction to this?
Well, I made one discovery last hour, and that is, I think the Dutch politicians are less naive than the English ones. When it comes down to assessing the situation within churches. But thank you very much for your very thought-provoking lecture. And I think it's also very inspiring to hear a presentation from someone who's working in the same field, but comes from different national backgrounds and also from a different discipline. And just also, not completely just for the sake of our discussion, I would like to maybe highlight a few of your remarks and maybe elaborate a little bit on them. One of the things that you more or less suggested is that there is a religious-free zone. You also pointed at the publication of the HM government, Her Majesty's government. Is that the case? Is there a religious-free zone in our Western European democracies? I would say that is not the case. I would say, on the contrary, that religion has always been fairly highly regulated. And perhaps after the Second World War, there was a slight lapse in this regulation. But the last 20 or 30 years, it's becoming increasingly regulated. And one can argue whether it's good or bad, or maybe in some dimensions good or bad, or desirable or not desirable. But I think we must recognize that there is no regulation-free zone for religion whatsoever. The second point, I sort of tasted a little bit, I had the idea from your impression that you say we must be very careful with liberty, and you favor more or less an approach based on equality, that equality is a sort of better perspective, equal treatment, non-discriminations of persons, better maybe than just looking at religion from the point of freedom. I would say the contrary. I would say that at the level of the individual, us as individuals, it's very important that the government treats us equally and doesn't discriminate us on the basis of our religion and belief. But when it comes down to social groups, and that was exactly what you were interested in, I would say equality is important, yes, of course, but in equal circumstances. And often the circumstances are not equal of the different religions within different societies. And it remains always very important to keep the perspective of liberty. And because I think otherwise you thwart the debate on the position of religion. And freedom is never unlimited. It has never been. It will never be. It's always limited and restricted. And we must talk about where lie the borders between what is allowed and what is not allowed. But basic perspective is that you should start to argue from a position of liberty. And therefore, I think it's important that you mentioned Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which guarantees these rights, but in the same article says, yes, of course, it can be limited. And it is. Is it the case that religion tends towards extremism? I'm not a scholar in religious studies, so for me that's a little bit of a slippery slope. But as far as I have understood it, that the great religious traditions have always had a way of dealing with people who are more committed towards religion. For instance, there is the religious office for those who are really committed, the clergy office, but also the monastic life or sorts of monastic living for those who in their individual life take religion to the extreme, and it's always encapsulated within a broader tradition. But perhaps you will say, yes, okay, but that's not really what I meant. I'm looking at the Church of England or maybe the Catholic Church or the Dutch Protestant Church. I can see to some extent that some churches are becoming more orthodox in their belief. I think it has to do with the sociological fact that institutions in general, whether it is political institutions, whether it's trade unions, that all institutions are having a difficult time with how they relate to their people, and that usually the ones who are less committed sort of disappear in the margins, which makes them slightly more orthodox. But at the same time, it also means that they function within a wider context of criticism and a wider context of liberalism. So they are smaller as institutions, but their surroundings are more liberal, and that keeps them a little bit in check. So that's one thing. I think the liberty is very important also for the more in the more orthodox institutions. Why is that? I see liberty and freedom as a sort of vehicle for peaceful value change. You mentioned homosexuality and gender relationships. Well, we can now say that it is very extreme, but until a couple of decades ago, the majority of the country was really thinking in those ways. Maybe slightly it was tolerated and we found a way of dealing with things. But look at male-female relationships. Now we think some things are extreme, but even when I was in secondary school, which is not so long ago,
in the light of eternity, yes. You were asking for it, sorry.
Gives me more time to think. But we as a society really thought about different things. So I think that the change in these values has gone very rapidly. And I think it is good that there are islands of liberty for those who cannot adjust so quickly, because I think it's also a matter of generation change, but who still have the liberty, who used to be the majority, who are now the minority, have some liberty and are not forced into certain positions. So I think liberty is a vehicle for value change. I think there is a debate to be made, and so also really for orthodox positions that we do not like, generally speaking, as a society. I think perhaps there should be a discussion maybe on the position of Islam, which comes from the outside in large numbers, who hasn't gone through our tradition of value change. There I think we could discuss, but basically I think liberty is very important as a vehicle, and equality would really create tensions. And I would say, yes, provocative, but I think those who want to champion value change, drive value change, in terms of female relationships, in terms of liberal morals like euthanasia, etc., like perhaps homosexuality, they are slightly more outspoken, because if you want to change something, you must be really outspoken. And I think just as a matter of a general sociological process, it triggers some reaction initially, which is a little bit more strong. Now I slowly come to my last point. You started with the fact that there are some institutions, lobby institutions in the United States and in Europe, who plea for religious freedom in the world. I also see that. I also see that it unites left and right from the political spectrum. I also think that sometimes they are a little bit, say, they could be more reflective in the way they deal with national context. But still, I think it is not bad that they call for this liberty. Personally speaking, my sympathy is a little bit more with the sort of dialogical style, which is aimed at the long term, rather than condemning countries to say, well, you're not really up to our national and international standards of religious freedom. Not personally my style, but I think it is good because it can complement that more dialogical style. So, last remark, where does it leave us? I do agree with your conclusion that it's important that religious is in the public domain. You had those moderating factors. I think that through those factors, religion is in public domain, therefore it is in some way more or less accountable to society as a whole. And I think it also implies an interaction with the state, as you also said. But I think that can only fruitfully take place when the roles and responsibilities of both parties are clear. And that means, in my view, also on the point of the religion and the churches and the religious groups, that their basic position of liberty as a starting point is really acknowledged.
Okay, thank you. You need not answer all these points.
Good.
You can
Good.
pick out what you find most important, what your most immediate reaction is.
I suppose. I mean, I'm a liberal, so I'm not against religious freedom or freedom, and I see the importance of it alongside a whole table of rights. But I worry that actually most religious people aren't free. So, for example, in Britain, take euthanasia again, to use that example. 70% of people want to see a liberalisation of the law. 70% of religious people want to see a liberalisation of the law. Those religious voices never get heard. Their leaders don't represent them. Most people assume that religious people are all against it. Even Catholics are hugely in favour of it. So there's an odd position in which most religious people aren't free. Mm-hmm. We don't have religious freedom at the moment, even though everyone's calling for it.
But that brings me to another question. I mean, very, very much related question. Why bother? Because that's the simple version of it. Let me get the little bit less simple version. No one is attending church anymore. Except a few people. The Church of England has a story of people leaving it for a long time. Mm-hmm. Same is true for this country, Catholic Church. A Protestant Church, I just read the other day, the let's say the Unified Protestant Church of the Netherlands is losing 70,000 people a year. So that's over in 10 years also. Mm-hmm. So we get rid of all these people. We get rid of the churches, we get rid of the leaders. So why bother?
So what do you think is going to happen when all moderate religion's gone completely, and there's just some extreme forms left, and everyone else is going to be living happily and harmoniously in a secular liberal democracy with which values and with what spiritual beliefs or none, or what's
the thing is, I mean, there are people in we are a department of philosophy, theology and religious science, and there's some people doing research about it. It's not true that it might be that organized religion is losing ground, and that's true, that's a fact. Yeah. It's not true that religion is, as such, religious feelings are losing ground. I think, but I'm some of them here. The opposite is true. I mean, people tend to believe in all kinds of things. They just don't believe anymore in what they are told to believe by some pope.
But then isn't it a problem that religious gatherings and the way the state relates to religion isn't paying any attention to those people?
But my question is, what is the problem?
And the old ones.
So my question is, what's the problem about it? As long as these people, they do all kinds of things. They hug trees. They swim with dolphins. They reintroduce wizardry. They do all kinds of things. But as long as they do that and they don't burn Parliament or bomb Utrecht Central Station, what is the problem? What is your worry, really?
That you seem, because my worry, I suppose, is that you're making that let's make that purely private. People can just hug a tree on Sundays.
Or Mondays, I don't care.
Any day.
Any day. Yeah.
But it's the point, again, about a healthy society, the private and the public work together. So how are those beliefs being talked about, represented in school? Mm-hmm. How do the kids of parents who are doing that, are they able to talk about that and think about those things critically? And where are the university courses where that happens? And what sort of provision is being made charitably for that group rather than this? So how is it coming together and enriching and being really part of the life of the country rather than just, this is just a private thing, we can forget about it? Because countries have to think really hard about their cultures and what their cultures are, and manage their cultures in a way. It's not just a complete free market. We think about what we stand for, what we believe.
You want to react to that?
Yes, I think coming back to this issue of euthanasia, it's of course a very complex and difficult terrain. There's a lot at stake. And I would say that if you're a liberal, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the good point of view. Maybe I think that personally, but I think there's also something to be had in those who you say have extremist views. And I also think that those so-called extremist views were the main views that we had only a few decades ago. And so I think we should look at it in a more nuanced way, in a way of value change, in a way of that we have new moral dilemmas caused also by technological process and so on, that really have to think of hard. And if you come to the law, well, I think, and I really experienced it myself, the law is and can be a very strong mechanism. What do I mean with that? If a majority of even one person says, okay, we're going to allow this, then it's suddenly allowed. And I think that for beliefs that are held very deeply in a society over a very long period of time, it is good that there is a long societal debate and that the law moves cautiously in that field. And perhaps it's not the best way, the law may not be the best at any given moment, but it's good to move cautiously, and therefore I think debate is very good. And the more, I wouldn't say extreme, but more outspoken views and the more liberal views should really try to find a common ground.
That's true. And another point that you raised, an interesting one, is you're challenging that there aren't any regulation-free zones.
Exactly.
Well, we definitely have them. You probably don't. We definitely have them. So we have very big ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities, say. We leave them alone. They have their own private schools. They do incredibly badly because they are inspected. They're at the bottom of the tables for educational standards. So those kids are not getting an education which will enable them to go to university or whatever. We don't regulate, we don't allow that. Same with homeschooling. If you want to homeschool, you can bring up your children any way you want without anyone noticing. Charities, they can basically do what they want. There's a bit of charity law, but it's not very heavy. And how religious bodies live their own lives, we keep out of that completely. And lots of abuses go on in that, and we think somehow we should let that be completely free. So there are quite a lot of regulation-free zones. I'm not for 1 minute saying there should be heavy state regulation. I'm saying there needs to be a better engagement and openness, more openness and interest, and proper investigation, including journalistic investigation. And I'm not saying we shouldn't allow extremism at all. I think a healthy society allows people to inhabit these positions, but there has to be. You have to know what's going on.
But then again, my question is, why bother? Because you keep repeating that.
You're an old hippie.
It's terrible. I'm an old hippie. But because you made a distinction between extremism pure and violent extremism.
Yeah.
But again, if you have extremists, which that have all kinds of strange beliefs, and maybe even educate their children not the way we liberal people would like them to educate them, and maybe we should go that far. But why should we regulate that kind of thing? Because now, of course, I mean, we talk here about the events after Paris. That's a form of extremism that we feel, so to speak, quite directly.
Well,
but this kind of extremism...
Perhaps we should talk a little bit what we mean with extremism. Is that something like terrorism, or is it just a minority point of view on a particular issue? Because
she gave a definition.
I gave a definition.
Yeah. So
it's taking things to their extreme of strictness and purity, and only one interpretation allowed, and you all have to believe this my way or it's wrong.
Yeah.
But I mean, you see, the truth is, it's just like, I do think there's a good analogy with the free market. So you can say, leave capitalism to run itself.
Yeah.
You'd say this: why bother? Why bother regulate?
Because
it's all fine.
Because there's less and less and less of them. So
let the banks do what they want. Let capitalism.
No, I wouldn't say that.
Let capitalism run the world. It'll all be fine.
No.
So you're saying let religion just run its own course. But actually, there isn't a real cultural free market or religious free market. So, for example, Saudi Arabia has funded a huge amount of education and charity and whatever, and pushed a very particular and pretty extreme view of what Islam is, with a lot of money behind it. And that has been very influential and is part of what's shaping the world
which
today.
we know is behind the
and
Charlie Hebdo
we
attacks,
completely
actually.
let that happen.
Yes.
We let that happen in Britain with no regulation whatsoever of what's sponsored and supported.
Yeah.
I don't think that's very sensible.
Yeah. But now we're talking about the violent forms of them, at least the forms of extremism that preach violence, because we know that in the case of Charlie Hebdo, we probably know it in the case of the recent bombings, that indeed these people are inspired by Saudi financed preachers that indeed preach violence and preach violent acts against liberal societies like the French one. But then you deal with a very specific form of extremism, namely the one that
yeah, but the Saudi schools they don't preach violence. That's just extremism. But there's a connection of the kind that I explained. So that's why it does matter, and it is important. And ideas really do matter.
Yeah. But then I think the next question is, should we be bothered about Islam? Should we be bothered about these extreme forms of Islam? And should we also be bothered about, the Anglican Church, the Roman Catholic Church? Because they don't tend to blow themselves up, do they? I mean,
well, look at history.
Well, they did, They stopped at some point.
Why did it stop? Because moderating forces controlled.
Yes.
And we've forgotten that it's really dangerous when they don't.
So is this your point? I mean, is that...
Who predicted 40 years ago that would be what happened in Paris? Everyone said, you're completely mad. Yes. It'll be fine. Yeah. There's not a problem here. Yeah. No, you have to keep your watch the whole time.
And is
I'm
this...
so miserable.
No. And this is what you mean about the fact that the problem with liberals is that they don't articulate liberalism, let's say as a belief, as something you believe in, as values you hold.
They don't see it's fragile, it needs defending, it needs the same propping up as Saudi is propping up, putting that money in defending. They think it's arrogance. Oh, the world's always going to be liberal. It's going to end up in liberal democracy. That's just the way it all goes, inevitably. So we don't have to do anything.
But then if we look at the French picture, isn't that more complex? Because in France, the official French ideology, state ideology, what the French call the valeurs républicaines, are strict church-state separation. Let's say the kind of liberal values you subscribe to and to actually to. And there you have the problem is not that these values are not articulated. They are articulated in school. You have to, if you visit a French school, you are more or less indoctrinated with these Republican values. But isn't the problem there?
That's the problem, though, because what I'm saying is you need to have religious and secular people together all the time. They need each other. And they both correct each other. Religious people have got things to teach secular people. It's important for both to argue, to strengthen their position, to get clearer. They need to be in good relationship with each other. So the France is just casting one out. That's intolerant as well.
And isn't the real problem there? You talked about these moderating factors, and which I think was very convincing. The cultural ones, the social ones, but aren't you omitting one very important one, which is the economic ones? I mean, these people that kill entire journals, people that bomb, that shoot people down in listening to hard rock concerts. They are inspired by Saudi-financed preachers, but they also come from neighborhoods which are completely off the radar, where people have no future and no education. Is this economic problem not much more important? But you talk about a discussion, about a dialogue, but these people don't feel they enter in dialogue.
Most are pretty middle class and wealthy. a lot of the terrorists, that's not the norm to be from those kinds of backgrounds.
Yeah, I just read that one of the one who I think is now still running indeed comes from a rather middle class family.
Yes, yeah, that does seem to be the pattern.
Yeah, coming to that extremist discussion again, and that one should regulate it. Well, I think if you talk about a Church of England or a Catholic church, or maybe what happens in a family, I think that should be really given the benefit of the doubt and given a large portion of freedom, and only through liberal democratic laws some restrictions that are necessary in a democratic society. And of course things can go wrong, and they do go wrong, but there are corrective mechanisms. But the alternative is a highly regulated domain in the social and in the social field. And I think that is certainly
not... Let's take... You're going to an extreme. You're going to an extreme.
No.
Take an example we were talking about before, which is schools.
Yes, okay, schools.
So we have faith schools, you have faith schools.
I think that's...
We don't say they're completely unregulated, they're totally free.
Yeah.
We say you have to teach these certain things.
Yes,
and you have to take a certain number of people from another faith. And those are perfectly legitimate things to say. That's not heavy-handed regulation. That's sensible control of...
Yeah, but look at indeed faith schools. I think that they should also be given a rather free liberty within their own position to be a faith school. And of course, when they do not have a good quality, when there's hate speech going on, when the teachers are not good, or when there's maybe finance from and through finance also influence from another country, surely that should be regulated. And at least in the Netherlands, it is regulated. And there's inspection on the quality of schools. And I think that works fairly good. Of course, you can never prevent that things actually go wrong. They do go wrong. But then there are mechanisms to correct that. But you cannot always prevent that.
Sure.
And so I think the basis indeed should be liberty. Again, when you talk to the bomb attacks in Paris, I think we are talking about a completely different ballgame here, because then also hard questions come into play about integration and the trigger factors of radicalization and terrorist action. And I don't think we have we do not completely know what goes on in that field. So I think it's tied up with immigration, lack of integration, whether it's religious or social, economic, and so on. So I think it is not wise to put it in exactly the same category as the Church of England.
I had a conveyor belt image, so they're on different stages down the extremism conveyor belt.
Yeah, but the mechanisms
the same dynamic is at play.
No, I don't agree with that. I think there's a different dynamic, totally different dynamic, and I think you should also treat it differently. Well, I think because when you talk about, say, larger religions and churches who have gone through, who are part of the Dutch society and who always have been part of the Dutch society, and who perhaps have become minority views, or views that were only until recently majority views in our own countries. We all believed in those views not so long ago. Then I think the liberty is very important, that they should not be forced into acting or behaving in a particular way. Maybe they will in some time, maybe they will not. Maybe the Dutch audience is well aware with the SGP case of the political party of the Dutch Orthodox NIT. In my view, the state should leave them alone, and that is something that will regulate itself over time. But give some time, give some space. Don't be too afraid for that. But in an integration situation which hasn't really functioned very well, I think there perhaps we should have some more antennaes.
So different approach.
Yes.
Different stages indeed. What would your reaction be?
Well, I'm not your kind of character in that I don't want to force the Catholic Church to ordain women. I mean, it's pointless. Even though I think it would be better if it did. Yeah. I would like the groups, as you say, for themselves to come to, and some do gradually. But what what I'm arguing for isn't forcing, a heavy-handed state forcing a law onto an unwilling body. What I'm arguing for is much more mechanisms by which you can be much more aware of what people in that group actually believe, pay more account to the views of ordinary people and women and children who don't actually have much power or say in that group. And the state actually is doing the opposite now. It's often locking out their views, listening only to the most conservative views of the leaders, and kind of fossilizing them. So churches in the UK, for example, maybe we're worse. They are banned from performing gay marriage. The law prevents them because that's what the church leaders said they wanted to be done, so no one could bring a case against them to Europe. So they've fossilized those religions now so that they can never change. And even though most Christians are now in favour, they have to go, they can't do it. And that's a terrible situation.
Well, maybe then the situation is different in England than it is in the Netherlands. Because if you say, we should leave that to the communities to really work that out for themselves, I think that is perfectly fine. I am in favor of discussion. I'm in favor of change. I'm certainly not against change, but I think some change should be forced by the state, but some also within the communities themselves. But I don't think the mechanism that you said, that the law of the land forbids churches to do so, that is alien to the Netherlands. If I understand that's right in England. So I think we must make a distinction. What should come from within the communities themselves, and what should come through politics.
But I have a question about so if you talk about the kind of state intervention, if you call it that you're thinking of, which is very mild and is certainly not authoritarian. What is it? What is the basis of that? I mean, what kind of state? Because the idea is that the state is value neutral. In a liberal view, the state itself shouldn't impose too many values. Should leave space for as many private values as possible. So, what is the basis for this kind of intervention? In the name of what? Not in the name of the Lord, I suspect.
Well, if you read that document take the UK again as the example, they now have had to be very clear what their values are. So they were always there, they were just implicit. So now they're really clear. They are liberty, they are equality of men and women, they are democracy and human rights and something else. And they say that's a kind of red line, and you can't cross that line.
So it's basically a human rights declaration, more or less.
In
a large sense.
In a kind of English version. But they're not saying we don't have any values. I mean, funnily enough, that's exactly what...
You don't have a constitution to begin with.
We don't have a constitution. No, but that's exactly what ISIL says. You don't have any values. You just let anyone do whatever they want. We have a lot of values, and they're lived out values, and they don't always have to be articulated, but I think you do better to be aware of what they are.
So you're actually happy about the fact that now they're forced, the government is forced to articulate those values. You find that a good thing?
I don't mind that at all, because they were always there implicitly, and it's better to be clear. And at least when something is clear, you can argue against them if you disagree with them, but you're laying out, actually, we're not value neutral. We do stand for certain things. Some of these are residually Christian. That's our historical background. Let's not pretend this is a universal, timeless, neutral state. I think probably that's a good state to be in.
I would agree with that. What about you?
I totally agree with that.
That's a pity. There's another. Before we give the floor to the audience for questions, there's just another point we haven't addressed so far. That your more let's say fundamental point about religion and religion tending towards extremism and the fact that it is more or less inherent to religion to do so. If you look at it from a historical point of view, I mean, if you look at it from, let's say, Europe's history, the Enlightenment, modernity, I mean, you talked about it briefly. Is that really true? Because, I mean, isn't it true that, I mean, Europe as we have it now, and it's probably going to shambles, I don't know, but owes its civilization, insofar as it has any, to the fact that indeed the extremist bit is left out. We don't cut people's hands anymore. We don't hang people anymore for religious views they take. We don't have religious wars anymore. Isn't that exactly the point? I mean, isn't the fact that Europe is Europe thanks to the fact that the extremism was sort of taken out? Or do I misperceive your point there?
I didn't make a lot of it, but my argument is that religion, if it was left on its own, would go down that path. But there are moderating influences from outside and inside. And for most of history, the moderating influences in the religion itself keep pulling it back. And your point about monastic life is a really important one. So religions have always had people who want to take things to the extreme, and they have very clever ways of dealing with it. Saying, okay, you have some monasteries on campus, don't you? Okay, you go and live in this building, and you do it here, and you can do what you like, but you're not going to take over the whole thing, because they realise what the consequences will be if that happens. So religions are very adaptive, and when they're in a good and healthy state, they don't let those wings take over. They can keep them in a good tension and use them as a creative force rather than a destructive force. And not all extremism leads to cutting off your hand. Extremism is taking things to an extreme. So you could say, well, the Hare Krishnas are extreme because they take love to an extreme. All the Hare Krishnas want to do is live a life of pure love. And it's mad. It's extreme. You can't live a life of pure love. But it's not always bad things that are taken to an extreme. But you say this is the only way to be. If no one else who does it is wrong, and they're not necessarily violent things. And they can be life-giving and creative and exciting. Kind of like salt in the bread, but not taking over the whole of everything and saying this is the only way and everyone has to be like this.
But yes, I see the point that you want to make, and I think that at least in folk religions, in larger religious groups, not small religious extreme, but larger religious groups, probably there is, just like in a general population, sort of differentiation that most of the people are more or less in the middle, and there are some people on the extreme sides on either way. It's like this. I think that, and I think it has been the way also within religions and churches and so on. But I see that institutions, the way institutions function nowadays, and maybe that's true for religious institutions, but I would say it's also true for trade unions, where the board and the leaders are more outspoken than many of the followers, even in political parties, whether they are to the right or to the left. They are more outspoken in the leadership, either towards the liberal or towards the right or towards this, than their general followers. And I think it has something to do with the role of leadership in organizations, that's one thing. And I think, secondly, it is...
And good constitutions.
Yes, and I think that it has...
Religion doesn't have that very often.
Yes, and I think so the role of leadership, and I think also that the well, I can call it a crisis, but the position, the difficulty that organizations in general have these days with how to deal with their the people who are standing behind them, with their members. That's a general problem, a general issue, I think. And so yes, but I would say that most people would, politicians, because they have the same situation, but most people would know that the leadership is not always representative of the whole group, that they are slightly more outspoken.
Yeah, but your point is that the state, certainly in Britain, only talks to these leaders and not to the ones they represent. So they get a false image of what we... That's really is your point, isn't it?
So then they falsely reinforce.
But
and they push the extremist trend on quicker than it would go normally. Not realising what they're doing.
I think the same might be true for Holland, but we have to turn to the audience. There's a very simple rule. You wait until the mic is there, and you speak into the microphone, and you ask a question rather than give a speech. So, who here?
Thank you for your lecture. What's the role of the media? You want to discuss it?
Thank you.
It's not my field, as academics say. It's not something I study a lot, but I'm aware that it's very, very important because it gives a lot of images and drives a lot of images of how I mean, even if politicians are trying to be moderate, for example, even if they're trying not to overreact to an attack, not to be driven by the agenda of the attackers, they can't necessarily control what the media does about it and how they react. Actually, they can have good conversations with each other, and they sometimes do, but sometimes the media, with politicians, can be acting in a sensible and moderate way, and the media can undermine that, is the obvious point about it's a big factor in how this goes and how opinions formed. And the far right and a far right press have played a big role in Europe recently, a really big role, and have wanted to stir up indignation and kind of reinforce the us and them mentality the other way around. So that just feeds, that's the opposite of what the fundamentalists want. They both feed each other. Mm-hmm. Oh, they hate us. Yes, they do hate us. We hate them. No, they hate us. We hate them. And it just goes on and on and on.
I think it's particularly relevant now for the Paris thing, where you see that we are all discussing how we can prevent terrorism from happening furthermore. Yeah. But the effect is that we're getting more fearful than instead of less.
Right.
And terrorism, the word terrorism means that
one really irresponsible bit of media, and the media now is so completely out of anyone's control that you will always get complete extremist secularist as well forms, which will say truly terrible things about Muslims, and then that will be used by ISIL's propaganda machine, which is very effective, and that will be played over and over again to say, look, this is what they really think of us. They think we're animals, and we were right to hit them, and so it's used, it's selectively used. And it's very hard to know how you could control that.
Yeah. Okay. If you just put it...
Okay, thank you very much for your lecture. I really enjoyed it. You mentioned that it's very important to have a dialogue in society to make democracy, to defend democracy and defend our societies. But now we face a situation where we do not have this dialogue. I mean, a lot of people do not even know much about Islam.
Yes.
Just to give one example, but also if it goes about the rights of homosexuals, there's not really a debate with those people who are rejecting it from religious point of view. So where should this debate, a public debate, start? And which institution or how should it be initiated?
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to talk a lot in these answers because I want to hear what you've all got to say. But my quick answer, it's not a whole answer, would be schools. Yeah. I'm a bit obsessed about schools at the moment. I'm doing a lot of work on how we teach religion in schools. But more broadly, and again, maybe we're particularly bad in Britain. We are really bad in the school curriculum. There is no space in which people can stand back and think, what sort of society do I belong to? Is it the one I want? What does this society stand for? How did it get here? People just think kind of democracy just happened. But what are our values? Do I agree with them? Do I not? And debate it, not just be taught it, but really debate it. And debate it with someone who doesn't agree with those values and thinks that actually having a strong state and no democracy would be better because we'd all be living under God's law. Debate it, talk about it. Kids are really able to do that from the earliest age, and we haven't got very good at doing that in my country, and I think that's really important to be part of the solution.
I think that makes sense, but what about the debate in the sense, debate in society, in the media, in a world which seems to polarize more and more and more, as you said, also in the wake of Paris, in which all of us take extreme positions, it seems, and there's no longer really a debate but a screaming match. How do we go about this kind of debate in that sense, rather than schools?
In the media. The media is not very good at debate because it wants to get extremes. Yeah. Because it makes interesting television to have the extremes, and it can make the argument interesting, but you usually get unrepresentative people, and again the middle gets left out, and so you don't hear articulate defences of a moderate, normal position. Yeah. So you're right. There's a problem.
But how do we? I mean, how would liberalism, let's say this kind of attitudes you're talking about, how could it reconquer the public debate as a debate?
They're good. I mean, let's thank ISIL. Maybe, actually, I'm not wholly pessimistic about what's happening because it does force you to say, well, what have we got that's worth defending? Why is their narrative wrong? Why is the West not now just their narrative, of course, is that the West is completely amoral. Yeah. It's like the end of Rome. People. That's why in Paris you go for homosexual clubs, you go for rock, you go for. This shows that these people have no values. Yeah. Well, actually, what values do those young people in Paris have? Mm-hmm. I think they have some very strong values, and it will force people to think more how would you answer that? Mm-hmm. And actually, that might be good for us.
Mm-hmm. Good, exactly. Yeah, behind you.
Thank you also. I've studied sociology in Nijmegen also. And I think the reality is more complex. I think we are focusing too much on the religious aspect of the issue, but we have also looked to sociological aspects. And I think there is also a lack of self-criticism. So if we are talking about violent extremism, we have also looked at the Western countries and their politics, policies, international politics, and for example, why do some people choose to use violent extremism? Mm-hmm. And what I am seeing in your speech is that you are looking at the issue from a very liberal point of view, mm-hmm. and from a state level. Mm-hmm. But I think it is, if we want to have a solution for this problem, then we have also to make self-criticism. And
you mean self-criticism from within our Western, for instance, yes. Dutch or English society? That's what you mean?
Yes,
sure.
So
sure. Yes, of course, you're right.
Ask ourselves also questions about what do we wrong, and because you have also about dialogues, but we have.
I think your point is clear. Thank you.
Yeah, no, your point's right, but still, there's a stopping point, isn't there? I mean, if the West has done terrible things, okay, but if, let's say it's a fight, the West, somebody, let's make it people, someone hits this other person, you hit me, you don't make me hit you back. So the West may have done terrible violence, doesn't make ISIL fight back. There's also a choice there. Otherwise, the West starts to seem like the only actor in town. It's not true. There's agency all over the world. So you've got to understand, you've got to give real agency to all the actors in this. ISIL doesn't have to behave like this.
Yeah, but what I actually want to say is if we want to find solutions, we have to look at the causes of the problem.
I think you're particularly referring to the Middle East situation, which is to a large extent a product of, Britain and France, actually.
It's not, to some extent, of course it is.
Yeah.
But you're making it seem like Muslims have no choice whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Whatever we did in 50 years ago has determined the entire course of the way that those countries go. I don't believe that for a minute.
Yeah, but
of course it sets the paths. Of course it sets certain trajectories. It hasn't determined what is going to happen. Yeah. We're not the only actors in this game.
No, but I think also that what she points at is that in the image of, let's say, people in the Middle East, all this talk about values and liberal values and this and that, and at the same time taking no responsibility for this kind of the past, the fact that the situation in Syria, for instance, is largely...
Who doesn't take any responsibility? Actually, there's a lot of discussion about what we've done wrong. We talk about it all the time. Mm-hmm. It's not as if it's not talked about, is it? The West is very self-critical. Maybe not the right wing, but there's a lot of self-criticism of the role. And not many people would say that invading Iraq was a really great idea, or Afghanistan was a great success.
No, even Tony Blair now
even Tony Blair now thinks that maybe this wasn't a good idea.
Yes. I think there was a question here. That one is faster. Yeah.
Does it? Okay. Yeah. So it's on. Okay. Thanks for the talk. I really liked it. I just think you focus a lot on the bigger picture, so more top down. What do we have to do qua politics and?
Yes, I did.
But when you talk about solutions, so for example, that we need to debate things in schools, I don't really think that debating on violence is even possible. So when you're in a debate and someone says, well, I want to shoot you or kill you for whatever reason, I don't think we're having a discussion. So in that sense, wouldn't you want to look at a more bottom-up solution to this problem? So we know that when children are being raised, that when they have some childhood trauma, they act upon this when they're older. So shouldn't we look to peaceful parenting and advocating against, for example, spanking as a solution?
But then you want state regulation to ban spanking.
No, not even just looking at the state, but just having a big campaign, not just talking about our values, but also at how do we not create people who adhere or are attracted to violence.
Yeah, that's
because you went over that really quickly.
That's a great question. That's a really good question, and you're absolutely right. That starts at the very beginning, doesn't it? And parenting and how you treat children at a really young age, what you see, what people do is much more important than talking, debating about those things. But how you make every parent a good parent.
Yeah, I think that's also really hard. But I think that when you when you talk to people about values, it's a bit more in the abstract. And when you actually say to the imams, for example, talk about values, you could also say talk about good parenting, which will result in children not being as quickly attached to these violent tendencies.
You're right. But, I mean, values is a bad word in a way, but values are practiced and lived out. I mean, an obvious example. Equality sounds like a really abstract value. But if you see in your own family as a child that the mother is not equal to the father, then you learn that one sex is better and more important than the other one. And you're more likely, if you're a boy, to be violent towards the other one because they're less important, or you've seen that. So equality actually, it may sound like an abstract, dry value, but it's absolutely fundamental to the way in which people are relating to each other, and it has a massive role to play in violence in society. Wherever there's high gender violence, there's also higher every other kind of violence. All the forms of violence are always linked together. So eliminating domestic violence, which is extremely high in Europe, is a major problem and a major issue that we're not talking about enough. And it is connected through things like pornography and the attitudes to women to extremism. So you're absolutely right. There are linkages that are really important.
So you agree with Sophie that equality is more important than freedom? Is that?
Did you say equality is more important than freedom?
No, I said just the other way around.
The other way around.
I didn't even say that it was more important, but at least it's equality tends to dominate the idea of freedom and liberty, also in the social domain, and I think that should be aware of that. Okay. And if I may add something about the dialogue, I think the dialogue is very important. And but I think dialogues take place all the time between religions, in religions, within the secular and the religious, all the time. Only the one thing that I find that is very difficult is that these dialogues are very hard to make visible. And the visibility of real good dialogues going on, I think that would be important. And then I come back a little bit to the role of the media. And we don't want to have all our frustration put on the media, but yes, they do play a particular role. I agree with that. I also agree that it's very difficult to get grips on it. But the good things that happen, like these dialogues, I think they deserve more visibility. But it's very hard to think through how that can be achieved.
Yeah, the point is that dialogues are very boring on TV. Opposition is much more entertaining.
Exactly.
That's the problem.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think there were several. I think the one on the back was first. And then here.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I was wondering, because of your description of extremism, if you could also apply to the Euro group with their strict norms to the ministers of the European Union. If you're talking about that, because they are also extreme in their views, so this kind of dynamic, if this could also apply to other kind of groups in society, and how does this work out?
Bankers.
Thank you very much.
Politicians, bankers.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, extremism is just it's wanting, as I said, it's just wanting to take something to an extreme, a cultural extreme. So it applies to all sorts of political, cultural, artistic movements, and it's always interesting to look at what's the moderating force in relation to those things, And states' business is usually to kind of strengthen the moderate middle ground. And it's very important business, and I think it has forgotten about it in relation to religion, and the religious freedom lobby doesn't help. Yeah. That's basically my argument.
Okay, here. Yeah, this is the last question. So you're very privileged. You get the mic.
I'm a bit nervous now.
It should be short.
You talked about, obviously it was a very European-centric,
yep.
when you talk about accountability for religion and integration with state and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, when you talked about Saudi Arabia and the money that was being put into like more extreme educational systems, how we address that as an international community that we are now, that we can't necessarily regulate foreign states, and how we address that issue.
They are friends, aren't they?
Yes, and that's yeah, of course, and there are a lot of difficult economic and political issues there. I mean, what is starting to be regulated is simply their presence on the soil of the countries where they're doing the regulation, and that you can. Mm-hmm. And it hasn't been. They've just been allowed to do exactly what they want and say whatever they want on the grounds of complete freedom. So that would be quite a good example of where I think actually you need to look at what ideas are being promulgated and what, yeah. Rather than, that was on the ground, but then there's also a role, there's also a big question which no one is answering properly about how global politics is done. And everyone knows, including national politicians, that it's not being done properly, whether it's in relation to climate change or tackling the refugee crisis or whatever it might be. Everyone knows we lack a proper mechanism for coordinating on really important decisions that affect the whole planet. And that is a major, major problem. But yes. Luckily, it's outside my lecture.
It's also outside time. Yeah.
Yes. I'm aware there are still many questions left unanswered, and well, I'm sorry to turn you down here, but maybe we can continue the discussion in the Cultuurcafé. I hope Linda will join us there, and Sophie and Kees as well. Well, thank you very much, Linda Woodhead, for your intriguing and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you very much for discussing with her. God, this is terrible. Sophie, sorry. And Kees, thank you for moderating this. Thank you for being here, for discussing with us, for having, I don't know, maybe some new thoughts on religion, or being just really disagreeing with what anyone said. So if you like this subject, next week, Tuesday, there will be a new lecture by philosopher Hans Achterhuis on the art of fighting peacefully. So do join us if you like. Have a nice evening, and thank you for being here.